Morning, it's Craig. I just want to talk about it really quick. I watched last night. It's called Piers Morgan Uncensored through YouTube. It's got a YouTube show, Piers Morgan. I'm sure you know the name. Anyway, and it was about Ukraine and Russia, and he had some panelists. He had a guy who wrote a book who was in his basement in Texas, basically more or less blaming America for the war. He had a girl in Ukraine, living in Ukraine. I think she was in Kharkiv, maybe, whose father actually got killed and by the Russians during this invasion. I think she's a podcaster. And they had General Wesley Clark. They had the guy who killed Osama bin Laden. I don't know his name off the top of my head, but I'm talking about the guy with the red hair. And they had Cenk, I think is how you pronounce it, Cenk from the Young Turks. So anyway, it started off with just a lot of Russian propaganda from this guy who wrote a book in Texas, and I'm not going to promote his book because his book is complete bunk. But anyway, he has it really sounded like this guy was getting paid by the Russians. He alleged he wasn't getting paid by the Russians for putting out false information. Generally, the Russian propaganda tactics are, well, you don't know your history, and they go through the whole history of the whole area, and which nobody does know the history. So, and then they say, the reason why you have this view is because you don't know the history. Well, the girl from Ukraine basically said that's all bunk. She said I was here during the revolution in the early 2000s, and this has nothing to do with the United States. As a matter of fact, she said it has everything to do with Putin just wanting to take Ukraine and put it back into Russia. She said it has nothing to do with NATO. It has nothing to do with the United States. And so the propagandist who lived in Texas, Russian propagandist, I'm going to call him, he basically was saying, it was about the expansion of NATO and threatening Putin. And then General Wesley Clark came on, who was excellent, by the way. And he was there. He was there during the 90s. He was there dealing with Russia. He was there when NATO got new members. And he's highly credible. Just one of the things, there's a lot of wars over in Eastern Europe around that time. I'm not going to get into it too much. But he served as the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. Excuse me, Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO from 97 to 2000. And he was a graduated valedictorian from West Point. He speaks Russian. He had a long military career. So he basically said that to the guy who wrote a book that more or less blames America, he said that's absolutely incorrect. He said there's a lot of misinformation on this show. The guy, Cenk, Cenk from the Young Turks, I was surprised because he was blaming the expansion of NATO. And actually, so was the guy who killed Osama bin Laden. And I was really surprised. And he came on and he said, look, I was there. He said, there's a lot of misinformation on this show. And he said, what happened they were trying to get Putin to come into democracy. But all the Eastern countries were afraid of Russia still. They didn't want to go back under Russian control. So they wanted to go into NATO because they wanted to be protected because they were afraid of Russia. They at first didn't want to take people into NATO because if they take more countries into NATO, it's a much bigger responsibility. And they didn't want to do it. But these countries like Poland wanted to come into NATO and and the EU. And what you see is, and what she pointed out, he said, if you drive from Poland now to NATO, excuse me, to Ukraine, Poland's in NATO, they're in the EU. He said, as soon as you go over the border, all you see is poverty in Ukraine. And the distinction is they're in the EU and they're in NATO because they're protected. So people will invest their money there, quite frankly. People don't want to invest their money in Ukraine because he didn't say that, but people want to invest their money in Ukraine, except BlackRock did actually. But they don't want to invest in Ukraine because, they don't even know if there's going to be Ukraine. So it was actually excellent. I would suggest you watch it. I'm not promoting Piers Morgan in any way. I just thought it put a lot of clarity on the whole situation. The girl in Ukraine basically explained the whole thing. She's like, look, I live here. My neighborhood is being bombed every day. She's a podcaster in Ukraine, fairly young girl. She'd be 20 or 30. It sounded like she'd maybe be in the mid 35 or something because she was going back to the Orange Revolution, which was sometime in Ukraine, which was sometime in the early 2000s. And, she basically s- told the story that Ukraine wanted to be in the EU and Russia wanted to take it. she basically said the same thing with Georgia. They're doing the same thing with Georgia right now. They're putting in a puppet government, and Russia's trying to take the country. And I just thought it was excellent because Wesley Clark is highly credible, highly credible. And it just put a lot of clarity. And it was funny because Piers Morgan said after Wesley Clark was speaking, he's like, "That's the story I know. That's what I know. What these other people are saying, I do not know at all." And I was shocked that the guy who killed Osama bin Laden, who I think is on Fox a lot actually, because he was talking about transgender stuff, and I don't know what that has to do with Ukraine. And I think I've seen him on Fox. I was kind of surprised. He was basically very anti-American in a lot of things, but like the girl from Ukraine said, this war actually has nothing to do with America. You know, it's narcissistic to think that everything involves us. It's black and white. They wanted to take back your Ukraine, and the I'm going to call him the propagandist from Texas asked Wesley Clark, and he said, "Who's to blame and what was the mistake?" And he said the mistake was his Bush too in the 2000s didn't work the relationship enough, and they should have worked more on making a friendship. And he said that's when it started to break down. And Putin's just not interested in democracy. He's interested in they're more or less a mafia. They are more or less it's mafia with intelligence is pretty much what Russia is. It's a mafia state. And he said that was the problem. And he said we should have worked on that relationship, let them know we don't want to invade. He said we don't want to invade Russia. I mean, why would we want to invade in Russia? Who would want to take on that problem, by the way? You know, it's a huge problem. Um, so it looks like I'm running low on my battery, so I'm going to cut it short. I could rant for a while. Um, I hope that didn't come up on my screen, but it's got to pop up. My battery's dying. So, all right. So thank you very much. It's I would strongly suggest it. It's Piers Morgan Uncensored on YouTube. The title it says is "Are you done with the Russian propaganda?" Um, and I would strongly suggest it because there's a lot of misinformation and wrong information out there. There's disinformation, which is intentionally wrong information, which is what the Russians do among other people. And then there's misinformation where you just put out the wrong information, but there's no intent. It's just wrong. So, all right. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.